Hi and welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today it's fantastic to catch up with my old boss Adam Hunt. I worked for Adam at the Financial Markets Authority in New Zealand. He was the head of strategic intelligence and part of the executive team. But Adam has a lot of governance experience. In fact, he's actually done a lot of work advising countries on their tax programs and things through the International Monetary Fund. And also probably the most well-read person I know on a massive range of subjects. A really amazing guy and someone that I always love spending time with. So thank you very much for your time, Adam.
It's nice to be here on a finally sunny day.
Yes, it's nice to have another sunny day in a row, right? It's 2 in a row I think we've had. Yeah, so I'll start with, I guess, a broad question about governance. What is it? What is governance?
Yeah, it's I come from an executive background, obviously, and people who do real work, and I always used to look on boards of directors as these grumpy old men who asked stupid questions and weren't paying attention. I think we've changed a bit. Mark and I were talking earlier, and I think that having a lot more women in the sector has just been hugely beneficial. The professionalism has increased significantly. But back to the question, I was talking to a CEO yesterday of a company I chair, and this came up, and I said to him, well, look, I think the key to it is it's there to primarily support. And I think that there was, historically, there's been a sense that you're there to sort of pick holes. And I think that that's a legacy that we're transitioning out of. It's very tempting to become quite defensive when you're an executive and you're reporting into a board. And I think one of the key things that a board needs to do is to support the executive in realising that they're just trying to look out for the interests of the business. And I think that comes back to a really important point. We as directors, and to a lesser extent, but in a similar way, even when you're in a limited partnership or something, in that type of scenario where strictly speaking you don't have those black and white directors' duties, your job there is not to represent the shareholders alone. I'm really pleased that the shareholder interests are becoming more balanced now. Mm-hmm. Because in a company, it's really important to remember your duty is to the company. It's not to the shareholders specifically. They're an important part of it, obviously, but it's to the company. You're trying to make this thing usually sustainable, profitable, and so on, and that includes a very, very broad range of stakeholder interests, not least of which is the people in it, which includes the executive. So I guess I'll kind of answer it in a negative way, which is it's not about picking holes in what the management of the company are doing. It's predominantly about supporting them, making sure the resources are available, and making sure there's consensus about the direction the business is going in, which is that strategic conversation which is so hard to do. It's really hard to do.
So it's providing a fresh set of eyes over different ideas and topics, and making sure that all the bases are covered, the risks have been considered, and the business is on the right track, and protecting the executive in many ways. Right?
Absolutely, and you know that I'm a diversity fanatic.
Yes.
I learned a long time ago that different perspectives are absolutely critical. You need different cultural backgrounds, you need all these things. You don't need a bunch of old white men who look a lot like me sitting around a table just turning up once a month for the directors' fees.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that we still, I think, as directors have a long way to go to tackle that image of what it is. One thing I always say, and I think I might be skipping to the end, but don't get into being a board member for the money. This is more about, I guess for me, it's more about a sense of personal fulfilment.
Yes.
And having a diversity of interests.
So to dig into that diversity theme a little bit more, you've mentioned the value that women bring and the different perspective they bring. You mentioned their ethnic backgrounds. What are the various angles of diversity that you find are valuable and why?
I think we've come a huge way. We've still got a long way to go with the gender diversity aspect. I think the cultural diversity is something that we're slowly getting our heads around, and I think we'll probably talk about my international experience in a moment around that. But I think the one that we miss quite a lot, we quite often pick directors because they have sector experience. But I always look for, and you'll hear one of my favourite stories that I've bored you with before. If you recall, when we were setting up the intelligence function at FMA, we had a very diverse group.
Yes.
And no offence, but I have a favourite hire out of that group for this specific reason.
It wasn't the male, pale and
And
stale.
it wasn't the pale stale, no. It was, we had an epidemiologist. And what an amazing background. And Imran brought culturally he brought a very gentle and different cultural perspective, but he also brought that scientific and analytical perspective, what I call proper science, into the mix.
Yes.
I think that's somewhere where we still need to do a lot of work.
So we've got the diversity of thought that comes from very diverse academic or educational backgrounds. That being a prime example. Diversity of thought that comes from ethnic backgrounds and different cultures, and diversity of thought that comes from gender. And no one of those is enough. It's kind of a spread of all of those things that creates a really strong, diverse board, right?
And it also makes it fun.
Yes, it does.
Because that team was probably the best team I've ever worked with professionally.
Certainly mine too.
And the debates, the discussions, I think the creativity that came out of that mix of people, if we could get that into the boardroom, I think that would be hugely powerful. We should set up a fund.
Absolutely. So tell us then a little bit about your international experience, because you've had such a diverse range of countries and things that you've been involved in at this level.
Yeah, so I mainly work in developing countries. Well, I think they're all developing countries. They're at various stages. I want to emphasise there's no right answer to what the result is, and I think this is one of the big lessons. Our image of what a stable Western, in quotes, we're not allowed to call it that anymore, but this stable Western model, I think, is starting to crumble a bit, and we're seeing that at the moment. Internationally, countries go through phases in their lifespan. And that's another interesting point, is that countries aren't set in stone. When I was a kid, there were 130 something countries. There's now about 180.
Yes.
And so we've kind of got this image in our heads, I think, that we've got it right and everybody else should catch up. The thing I've learnt more than anything else is that you go to other countries and official IMF guidance is don't do that. But the IMF are wrong. We see better ways to do things. A good example of that from my technical background is GST in Rwanda and Uzbekistan. They're putting progressive GST in. So what that means is the GST rate when you spend varies depending on your income. Now this is something that blows our Western models. Can't cope with the idea of doing that. The reason they're able to do it is because they're leapfrogging us technologically.
Yes.
But there's also these cultural differences. Certainly in my, and I'm one of these. I'm a fanatic about privacy, and so the idea of having a national ID number is just horrible to me. But a lot of countries don't care. They have voter registration cards. They use the voter card as their identity card. Now, in our society, that's verboten.
Yes.
For historical reasons. But as soon as you do things like that, you enable all these other methods. All of those All of that rests on having a trusted relationship between government and the people.
Mm-hmm.
That is, we tend to look at developing countries and think they're not as good at that as we are. But frankly, we can all think of 2 or 3 examples of ostensibly advanced Western economies that are really struggling with that trust now.
Absolutely.
And the reason I wanted to raise trust is because that's what governance is all about. So you've got to have trust in the institution. So it's about the systems that get the people into the positions of governance.
Yes.
So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is the trust in the people once they get there.
Mm-hmm.
And we all struggle with that. Every country struggles, every business struggles with that. We want to believe there's a leader there, or a group of leaders, who will do the right thing.
Yes.
To me, that's absolutely the foundation of any governance arrangement. But it builds off that, the way you get them there.
Yes. Which will be in your founding document, in your constitution.
Mm.
Right. And then once you're in there, your accountability, your transparency, letting people know what's going on will be a way of building
absolutely.
trust.
And I think that one of the things that Ardern was was lauded for was her communication skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm quite fanatical about shareholder communication. And this is a thing about smaller businesses or mid-sized businesses. There's often a shareholder agreement sitting in the background.
Mm-hmm.
They're often secret. The reason they're done as a shareholder agreement is so that it's not public. I'm quite controversial because I hate shareholder agreements. Get it in your constitution so it's publicly available,
mm-hmm.
or don't have it. There's a few exceptions to that.
Yes.
But most of the time, as soon as you put in a shareholders agreement that gives appointment rights and all sorts of rules about who's going to run the business, you actually start to erode that trust.
Right. Yeah, of course. So what lessons can be learned from your experience in governance in corporate and national government level to not-for-profit organisations where it's a membership-based organisation with a purpose, and then having a board of directors that's elected to perform this governance role?
There's a couple of interesting things been going on over the last few years in the not-for-profit space that I'm still thinking about. You may have noticed, so in New Zealand, and I'll connect this in a minute. In New Zealand, we have a lot of incorporated societies, so membership-driven organisations. The members vote is what it boils down to. The members are self-selecting, so you sign up, you pay your membership fee, it buys you a vote. To me, that's a little bit like a poll tax system. You used to, if you didn't pay the tax, you couldn't vote.
Couldn't vote, right.
We realised a long time ago that isn't a representative democracy because there will be other stakeholders.
Yes.
So I'm just drawing that out because there's been a trend over the last few years to move to charitable trusts, which aren't a membership-driven organisation, they're a trustee-driven organisation. So what you do is you create a charter, a set of rules, and then the trustee's job is to apply those rules.
Right.
I'm drawing that out because one of the things I think not-for-profits need to do is understand who their stakeholders are so that they can pick the right approach to establishing the organisation.
Yes.
It's entirely appropriate to have a self-selecting membership base in, I don't know, an international sports organisation, for example, because you want people who are interested. Mm. But if the primary purpose of that not-for-profit is actually to distribute funds to disadvantaged people, then the trust model might be better.
Yes.
So it's it's interesting because it then drives what the governance requirements are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a membership-driven organisation, the job of the leadership is there'll be a statement of, like a charter of some description. There will be rules about what that needs to be, and how those objectives are met. But they often fall over because the governors come out of the membership base. They often have a personal agenda, and that, I think, is where it becomes a challenge. So it could well be that those types of organisations, if you look at the International Olympic Committee and so on, they are less self-selecting.
Right.
And arguably more successful in a lot of regards. So I guess, sorry, it's a bit of a fuzzy answer, but I was trying to relate it back to your interests, and I think that one of the discussions that needs to go on as we move from a bunch of well-meaning amateurs who are interested in a thing, and the not-for-profit grows, you may need to change the way you establish it.
Yes.
Which will drive the governance approach.
Right. So, I mean, to take exactly that point, as you say, a lot of not-for-profit organisations, the people that end up on the controlling body, whether it's an executive committee or a board of directors, are people that have come up through the sport, are passionate about the sport, but don't necessarily have the governance knowledge, the governance skills, or the governance background to perform the role. How would you kind of transform that into a board of directors model where you have the right skills in place?
So what a lot of organisations do, and I've served on the board of the Domain Name Commission, which is a subsidiary of Internet New Zealand. Internet New Zealand is a membership-driven organisation, self-selecting voters.
Yes.
But interestingly, it represents every Internet New Zealander user in New Zealand.
Right.
Should that be a membership-driven organisation? I would argue that probably not.
No.
It was interesting that they chose many years ago to separate off their governance role into a subsidiary that had appointed directors.
Right. All appointed?
All appointed.
All appointed.
So there was no elections. It was, you're on the board of the Domain Name Commission. You hire the domain, the Domain Name Commissioner, they're called.
Right.
And, you have the appointment rights, and you hold the DNC, the Domain Name Commission, to account against these rules, the rules of the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think we can learn a lot from that, and it'll be interesting to watch over the coming years how that evolves. So I think the lesson out of that is sometimes you need to carve off pieces of the governance structure where there are very specific requirements around them.
Yes.
And just recognise that.
Yeah, right.
So you see that in a lot of not-for-profits. They are, I've seen over the last few years, they're separating out, I'll use the sport analogy, the sort of technical rules, regulations, those types of things, and promoting the sporting ethos. They're separating that from, and we've also got an organisation here that has income and assets and needs to protect the long-term brand and those types of things.
Right.
And they're separating that off into a separate governance board.
Right.
I think the thing you need to be careful of is you still need to make sure there's an overlap in the membership of those two governing bodies.
Who would then be involved in appointing that governance board? Is that from the other part of the organisation, a big part of that?
Yeah, the one way to do that is, and I'm associated with a couple of international organisations that do this. They have national chapters, and the national chapters vote for a governing board.
Yes.
So what you're doing is you're kind of carving it up a bit so that it's not a free-for-all. And our model of democracy, we're not used to that.
No.
But if you look at a lot of countries, they actually have runoff processes for presidential elections, those types of things.
Yes.
And it's a similar type of scenario where you may have a very broad field and it's useful to help the voter to progressively narrow that field down.
Yes.
until you end up with basically a consensus decision. Because a consensus-based approach has always got to be your preferred option.
Yes, yeah, of course. Our New Zealand's organisation's model is, and the Incorporated Societies Act is now changing so that the majority of board members have to be elected from the membership. But we currently have a model where half of the board is elected from the membership and the other half is appointed by an independent appointments panel. Well, partially independent. It's got a board member on it and then a couple of independent governance people. And that way you can identify the skills that you have in your elected people, identify your gaps using a skills matrix, and then complete your board.
And I think that's a very wise way to do it. Which of course mimics what listed companies do.
Yes.
They
some voted by the shareholders.
Some voted for, but the kind of the short list often come from an appointments panel.
Yes, absolutely.
With some professional advice.
Yeah, okay. So, can you give us a little bit then about the differences in governance that you've seen from overseas, and what we can learn from that? And also, generally this whole concept of what governance is that concept fairly standard across the globe, and it's just different ways of dealing with different approaches to solving it, or are some models of governance trying to do completely different things?
That's a really good question. I think the underlying objectives always boil back to the same thing, which is I want someone I can trust to represent my interests. But once you move beyond that, one of the things I see in a lot of other countries is the ethnic blend. There's often quite a power imbalance. Look, the obvious example I've worked with in the last few years is Rwanda, where we saw how it can just go horribly wrong. It's not just religious either. I work in a lot of Islamic countries, and they're lovely places to work, because there is a binding camaraderie amongst the people, which isn't so much about the religion. It goes deeper than that, because it's about the culture.
Goes right into the culture.
Thousands of years ago of history there. Ethiopia is a fascinating country because they look upon our versions of Christianity as modern upstarts, because they were Coptic Christians way back in the day, and of course they sheltered the prophets, one of the prophet's wives, so they have a very good blend of religions in there. And it's interesting seeing how they discuss issues amongst themselves. And I've been in rooms where there have been some fairly tense conversations about tax policy and things. And the respectful way that they talk to each other, I think, arises from that history of understanding that you've got to live with your neighbour.
Right.
In our society, we have a lot more migration, I think, in a way. I came to New Zealand when I was 9 months old. I went to another country to grow up. I came back, and one of the things that does is, and in New Zealand we move every 7 years, and I think that can damage that feeling of being close to your neighbours.
Yes. So
I think that I think we've got a lot to learn, and one of the reasons I think the Māori culture has a lot to offer is because that comes from a place which is about family and about
the
negotiation.
Tie to the land and the tie to where you're from, that brings the husband and
We've got
together.
a lot to learn from that, because we've lost something when we industrialised.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to change topic a little bit, I know this is an area that you'll have a lot of interest in, and that's this rise of ESG, the social and governance aspects of investment and the environmental aspects. What impact is that having globally on governance?
I think I'm a great supporter of it, and the reason is it's easy to be cynical about these things, and cynics are people who've just given up hope. I don't know how they get up in the morning. It particularly irritates me when they call themselves realists, which is just a coward's word for cynic. And what I think the ESG movement has done is to structure and validate what you knew was right.
Yes.
And I think that's a good thing, because it's given us a language to talk about it. And it's allowed it to enter the boardroom without a bunch of typically old white men going, oh yeah, well that's just unrealistic. Because they're wrong. You know, they're simply right. History has proven them wrong. Because otherwise women wouldn't have the vote. Because you can imagine what the boardrooms were like when that was going on.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think it's useful. I think there are some holes in it, but the fact that it legitimises and provides a language to talk about it at that governance level is hugely useful, and we need to keep supporting the movement, especially over the next sort of 50 years, because we're going to have some serious migratory challenges driven by climate change. We're going to have food shortages. We're going to have, whole parts of the planet are going to become uninhabitable.
Yes.
Climate change, I know, our climate has always changed. It's just never changed this quickly before.
Yes. Well, not in our experience, not in our living experience.
Since the dinosaurs. But it's just going to, what our kids are going to have to deal with is going to be horrendous. And providing these types of mechanisms so that we can talk about and plan for and consider people and just being decent to people. How could you argue against that?
Absolutely. So it's about broadening the conversation at the board level beyond the pure purpose of, in a company's case, making money, and even in a not-for-profit's case of their narrow purpose, but broadening out to the widest stakeholders, to their impact on the environment and stuff around them as well, which is ultimately going to make everything more sustainable, going to make the entity itself more sustainable over the longer term, because it's more aware of what's going on around it.
And I think, the sports organisation's got a huge role in this, because they are all about driving that sense of community.
Yes.
It's about working with a team. Even if it's an individual sport, you're surrounded by a team of people working with you.
Yes.
And you do it because it's fun. What better organisation to promote this idea of community and supporting each other and just being nice to each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've got a program that we use for our 3 to 5 year olds, and the first rule they learn is be nice to each other. Yeah. That's exactly it, right? Makes a much better society. One final question for you then. In your extensive experience in governance, what's the best advice you've been given?
A guy called Roger Martin, when I first became a CIO, he said to me, you're going to be hiring people and appointing people, and you've got to understand that they won't do it the way you do. And I realised later on that what he meant was they'll probably do it better. But your instincts will be, they're not doing it the way I do it, so it must be wrong.
Right.
And that to me goes to the heart of this diversity thing. It's the only way you learn is by letting other people show you a better way of doing it.
And that comes down to as well our experience with the team that you hired at the Financial Markets Authority, and hire people that are not like you. Because if you hire people like you, you're just going to get more of the same thing that you would do. You hire a diverse team. It's
very comforting, but it's not sustainable.
It is, yeah, it does. Yes, I can absolutely understand that. You get out of your comfort zone a little bit when people challenge you in different ways.
We used to have some quite robust debates in the room, didn't we?
We certainly did. We really did. But what came out of those debates was just fascinating stuff and really good. And I think they might have lost that a little bit recently. But in any case, so Adam, thank you so much for your time and your conversation. It's been fantastic.
Well, it's, I'm an old white man. It's always nice talking about myself.
Well, I look forward to our next catch up and our usual social occasion, and I'll see you next episode.